Live inside the Beltway after a grim weekend. You know by now of Saturday's shooting in Buffalo of a racist who murdered 10 people while they were doing their Saturday afternoon shopping. More details on the 18-year-old who was radicalized into becoming a white supremacist online. He had been taken into custody during his senior year in high school last year after he made alarming comments that he was going to shoot up graduation. One of the areas where many people disagree. I believe in the severe threat order of protection, which allows police to seize any weapons that such a person has and to maintain that they may not buy weapons. That did not happen. I don't know what New York's laws are, but they ought to have that. He got worse over the course of a year. He lives with his two brothers and apparently normal mom and dad in a suburb, and was a quiet sort of not there loner in high school. The profile is all too familiar. He went down the trail of white supremacy, and his screed is full of angry replacement theory, which is nuts, and it's not true. And I've said that many times on this show. The killer in Laguna Woods, you may not know about. Yesterday afternoon, a 60-year-old Asian man, that's the only description I have from the Los Angeles Times, stood up in a luncheon honoring a former pastor at a Taiwanese Christian church in Laguna Woods, which is not far from my old home in Orange County. They were welcoming back for a luncheon Jerry Chen. Excuse me, I want to get that. And that Jerry Chen was the fellow who gave the quote. The former pastor's name is in here somewhere. I can't find it. But Tom Kramer, who is the head of the Presbytery of Los Ranchos, again, I used to be a member of this presbytery. Kramer did not know if the pastor was harmed in the shooting. A pastor clobbered the gunman as he tried to reload with a chair, and a bunch of the so-called older victims, they were all in their 60s, those not shot, tackled him and hog-tied him. But it's a 60-year-old Asian man is the killer there. In Harris County, Texas, the more traditional weekend shooting, two young men shooting at each other, wounding 3 and killing 2 at a Harris County flea market at 1 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. So guns are everywhere. The Wall Street Journal, however, wrote about the particular evil of the Buffalo shooting. There is a culture of white supremacy in the United States, and people need to understand it's not large, but it's definitely evil, and it's dangerous because it attracts the unbalanced, like this 18-year-old. This was pure evil, said Erie County Sheriff Garcia in an apt summary of the mass murder at a supermarket in Buffalo, writes the Wall Street Journal. That appears to be racially motivated. The alleged shooter, 18-year-old Peyton Gendron, last time you'll hear his name on my show, is another young man possessed by inexplicable hatred. We'll learn more about the shooter's motives and mindset, but it's worth noting a report in the Buffalo News that an official in the school Mr. Gendron attended in Conklin said he spoke of wanted to go on a shooting spree. He fits the profile of other young men who become mass shooters in an age when mental illness often strikes. Keeping guns out of the hand of the mentally ill isn't easy, but it's one form of gun control that could do some good. Mr. Gendron is suspected of being the author of a 180-page manifesto expressing racist and anti-Semitic views. He seems to have targeted the Buffalo neighborhood for its heavily black population, drove 200 miles to get there. He may have been seeking to imitate Dylan Roof, the deranged white man who killed 9 African Americans at church in Charleston in 2015. Partisans are already using the massacre to leap to broader political conclusions, as they always do. There's no doubt that a racist subculture exists in America and is spread on social media. Politicians and media figures have an obligation to condemn it. Absolutely correct. And I do, and I hope you have. And such conspiratorial notions as white replacement theory. And I do, and I hope you have. But mass shooters have had many motivations in recent years, and mental illness seems to be the most significant common denominator to the extent there is one. Meanwhile, we should salute Aaron Salter Jr., the security guard at Tops Friendly Market store. He fired at the gunman, but the bullet was reportedly blocked by body armor. Mr. Gendron then shot Salter, whose bravery may have given others time to hide or escape. Salter is the hero who speaks to the better angels of our nature. On to the news from abroad. Ukraine on Monday claimed its troops had reached the border with Russia after weeks of a successful counterattack that pushed Russia's invading forces back from the eastern city of Kharkiv. That is good news indeed, and I also want to let you know that according to news notes from John Ellis, the The Russian offensive is in trouble in the Donbass as well. I knew they had been losing all across, but now they are losing in the Donbass as well. Russia has probably lost about a third of the ground forces it deployed to Ukraine, and its offensive in the Donbass region has lost momentum and fallen significantly behind, British military intelligence said. Despite small-scale initial advances, Russia has failed to achieve substantial territorial grounds over the past month while sustaining consistently high levels of attrition, the British Defense Ministry said on Twitter. Russia has now likely suffered losses of one-third of the ground combat force it committed in February. It said Russia was unlikely to dramatically accelerate its rate of advance over the next 30 days. It's quite possible Russia will lose the war in rather spectacular fashion. NATO sees Ukraine victory possible as defenders continue to foil Russia, according to the Times of Israel article this morning. In Eurovision, Ukraine won. And then Italy thwarted cyber attacks by pro-Russian hackers who wanted to stop that victory. Good for Italy. Sweden and Finland have made NATO applications formal on a historic day for the Nordics. I talked about that with Admiral Stavridis on Friday, and we'll talk more about it in the weeks ahead. Turkey's president objects to Finland and Sweden's NATO applications. It requires unanimity for a country to be accepted into NATO, so they're going to have to work on Erdogan, or they might have to throw Turkey out, because I'd rather have the Swedes and the Finns than Erdogan. I really would. North Rhine-Westphalia results deliver blow to Scholz. They have come to the conclusion in Germany that Olaf Scholz, who was the last man standing in the last election, is not a leader, and the Christian Democratic Party, which rarely wins in Westphalia, did. And they will form and govern, as a governor would, in an alliance with the Green Party. China's economic activity plummets as COVID lockdowns hit growth. And this is from the Financial Times. China's economic activity contracted sharply in April as a wave of lockdowns across the country posed the most significant challenge to its growth prospects since COVID began. That means eventually, although we have 8.5% inflation in the United States and the wholesale price index went up 11% last month, that Hezbollah and its allies, that the recession that is expected will probably come sooner rather than later in the United States. Hezbollah and its allies lost an election in Lebanon yesterday, with the Christian Party picking up seats, probably the largest single party in parliament. I'm not sure. The Lebanese political process is so opaque to outsiders, I can't tell you what that means. But I can tell you should read the Washington Post story, A Magnet for Ripoff Artists. Fraud siphoned billions, that's billions with a B, from pandemic unemployment benefits. Potentially $163 billion stolen from the pandemic unemployment efforts. That's a lot of money. I'll come back with more, America, when I return to the Hugh Hewitt Show live on this Monday inside the Beltway, a tragic Monday. Your calls and more ahead on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Salena Zito is here with the Yinzer Report. The Pittsburgh native tells us everything we need to know about Tuesday. What I want to know, the most important thing, Salena, is Dave McCormick going to be able to win with a closing kick tomorrow in the Pennsylvania GOP Senate primary, as I have judged him the only Republican capable of beating John Fetterman in the fall?
Well, you're right. He is the only candidate to beat Fetterman in the poll. I don't know, did you see yesterday that John Fetterman had a stroke?
I did. I saw this morning his comments that he's fully recovered and no mental damage, and that is good news.
Yeah, I chatted with, he's fine. But anyway, so I had thought all along that McCormick would pull it out, even when Trump endorsed Oz, even when Trump came in and held his rally, which had less than 1,000 people at it, and but then he went scorched earth on McCormick. And when he went scorched earth on McCormick, Oz at the rally, Oz used that as an ad, and then that drove up McCormick's negatives, which he had barely any. That made Barnett run, and she rose up last week, like an insurgent candidate tends to do. But I think she peaked Wednesday and started to fall under the scrutiny. Now, the only thing that makes me wonder if she can pull it out is if the Trump endorsement of Mastriano, who is running for governor, both Barnett and Mastriano have been running together for months. If that boost takes Barnett over the finish line.
But she's not electable. I read your
No,
column.
she's not
She just
electable.
cannot win. She's like Eric Greitens in Missouri, and I rarely say that about someone. Maybe Dr. Oz could win. Maybe I don't think so because he's not really a Republican. But Donald Trump wasn't a Republican. But Dr. Oz is not Donald Trump. There's only one Trump, and so McCormick really is a Republican and really is good on national security. He's a Bronze Star recipient. I'm going to replay his interview in the 8 a.m. hour. How has he spent this weekend, McCormick?
Making me exhausted, going across the state, I've been, following and driving across the state for the past week. I've just been on the road in the 67 counties. McCormick's strength is when he's in person, he's just much better on the stump than the what the ads have done to him. And when people see him, when they hear him, when they question him, they really, really like him, and they're really impressed with him. And that is what I think takes him over the finish line.
Well, talk to me a little bit about the early voting. Pennsylvania was sort of. Is it just not much of a factor? Have people been holding back?
It's never been part of our culture, and it's just not something that we don't. I mean, obviously, people voted by mail during COVID. However, if you look at last year's November election, we were, pretty well back into voting in person.
Okay, you and I both know that Josh Shapiro, the Democratic Attorney General, is a formidable candidate. He is going to be the happiest man on Tuesday night if the Republicans nominate Mastriano and Barnett or Oz, right? He's like going to dance a jig.
Oh, the Republicans are going to lose the Senate seat. They're going to lose the governor's race. They're going to lose 2 congressional seats that they could have taken away from the Democrats. They're going to lose the majority in the state House, and they're going to lose the majority in the state Senate. This has annihilated the Republican Party in this state. And you have to remember that this is about 20% of the base that is going to do this, because there's so many people in the race. There's about 20% of the base that doesn't care who's electable, that doesn't care who's the best candidate, that's just on a bender, and that's who they want. They want to stick it to the establishment. This isn't all of the party, but this is about 20% that's going to, that if these insurgent candidates go across the finish line, are the ones that are going to have the largest impact on the Republicans winning the Senate and the governor's race and all the other seats in Pennsylvania. And by the way, it's also going to cost seats across the state, because the Democrats are going to wisely say, are you just like Mastriano in Pennsylvania? Are you just like Barnett in Pennsylvania?
If McCormick gets the nomination and Mastriano, can he separate from, I mean, Mastriano's way out there. Can he separate himself from that and still win?
Yes.
All right, Pennsylvania. I think you ought to vote for David McCormick and Lou Barletta. Am I saying his name right? I don't know much about the race, but he's electable. Yes. Lou Barletta for governor, Dave McCormick for senator, but definitely Dave McCormick, because we're not going to get the Senate back and Joe Biden is going to be unbound. And all you people have to realize, if you let Joe Biden have that 51 seat again, or 50 seats plus the vice president, it's all on you, Pennsylvania. The vote is tomorrow. I'll continue to cover it. SalenaZito.com for all things Toledo. Come back for my second hour on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Morning, glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. It's Monday, May the 16th in the year of our Lord 2022. I'm Hugh Hewitt, inside the Beltway Live, joined by Jake Sherman, as I am most Mondays, Punchbowl news editor. If you're not getting punchbowlnews.com every morning, then you're just a dummy because it doesn't cost you anything and it gives you everything that's going to go on in Congress this week. It looks like a bunch of hearings, Jake, but I want to start with your quote of Chris Murphy yesterday talking to my friend Jonathan Capehart. I don't think you get 60 votes for his bill. I think you could get 60 votes for a stop order bill, the severe threat order of protection. I just don't know. I don't know what's in Murphy's bill, but it's not narrow enough. Has anything changed with three more shootings? You know, there was one in Orange County yesterday, not 10 miles from where I used to live, at a Taiwanese Chinese church, where a 60-year-old man shot up five people. There was one in Houston, of course, the awful one in Buffalo. Does anything change?
No, there's no legislation, Hugh. I really don't think, unless I'm missing something, that will get 60 votes. There have been efforts, as you note, to boost the reporting system for people with mental illness and things like that. That has not gotten the attention or the energy from anybody. So we're kind of in this position. I mean, Chris Murphy was deputized earlier this year, I believe, maybe it was last year, to work with Republicans to see what he could get 10 votes for, be it anything, be it a background check bill or something more, and he's not been able to find 60 votes for anything. So that's kind of where the status of the situation.
I talked about severe threat orders of protection with Doug Ducey last week when the Arizona governor was in town, and his bill did not pass the Arizona legislature, but it came whisper close, and it was opposed by some gun rights extremists. But those actually apply. They don't apply across the board. They apply to people who, like the killer in Buffalo, have been taken into custody for making a threat of mass violence shooting, as this killer was in Buffalo, and then they say, for a time certain, you don't get to buy a gun. We don't know how he got his rifle. We don't know that yet, but it just seems to me.
No, we do. There's been coverage of this.
Tell me. I missed it.
Yeah, but I think it was in the Post, the Washington Post. I'm not entirely sure. It could have been in the Times, but he just walked into a gun store and bought it. Lawfully bought it.
But do you know which month it was? Was it after he went into custody in high school?
I believe so. I can look right now, but anyway, I think he bought it recently. Here we go. He bought it in January from Vintage Firearms, a small gun store about 15 miles from his home, paying $9.60 for the rifle, a sling to carry it, and some ammo. But he also bought a shotgun in December and a semi-automatic rifle that he received from his father at Christmas at 16, and he modified the gun with his. This is in his telling, with his father's drill, in order to remove a state-mandated lock that prevented the attachment of magazines with more than 10 rounds of ammunition.
The reason I ask is because the weapon that he used, I assume it's the last gun that he bought, that would be 7 months after he was taken into custody for a psyche evaluation. And those people who make a threat and get a psychiatric evaluation should not be able to get a gun until such time as they have another court hearing that says you're okay. Because we don't want people named and forever put on a list where they can't exercise their Second Amendment right. But if this kid just doesn't, he shouldn't have been able to buy a gun. Does that article say which paper is it in, Josh? I've been reading a lot of these.
It's in the Washington Post. I posted it yesterday at 8:45 p.m.
Okay.
The headline is "Massacre Suspect That He Modified Bushmaster Rifle to Hold More Ammunition." Excuse me. So it was that Bushmaster that he used in this awful.
Not the one his father gave him.
Right.
Okay,
right.
So the question would be, did he have a background check at that time? Did it show a red flag?
He did have a background check at that time, and it said here that they interviewed the owner of Vintage Firearms, 75-year-old Robert Donald, who told ABC and the Times that he sold the Bushmaster to him. He said a background check raised no flags, and the agent from ATF visited his shop on Saturday night to collect paperwork from the sale.
So the question to Chris Murphy, the question to everyone is, how would your law change that interaction? He had a background check. He got the rifle. He had previously been taken into custody on a psych evaluation. How does your law change that purchase? And of course, in California, it'll be a different inquiry into the A 60-year-old man is the killer in California, Jake. I don't know if you've read that yet this morning.
I've not. We were just focused. We didn't include that for reasons that are not clear to me. But no,
Well, I just found it. I mean, it may have
Yeah.
just overnight reporting. It's always 24 hours on this. With me to the rest of Punchbowl News. Hearing on top of hearing. There is nothing that the Democrats can do to ease the infant formula other than get the FDA up to the J&J plant and open it up. And the J&J, I think it's J&J, say they're ready to go, but the FDA hasn't signed off on it.
Yeah, this is going to be, when this first started hitting, becoming public, this huge shortage in baby formula, I said to our colleagues, I'm not sure what Congress can do besides bring attention to the situation, which, obviously they are doing. But I think Nancy Pelosi was asked if the president should invoke the Defense Production Act, and she said that there would have to be changes to the law here to allow that to happen. So, I mean, listen, this is I've been toying around with this idea in my head, Hugh, for the last couple of days. If you just think about how much is going south for Democrats at the moment, and some of these things are out of their control. I mean, this is a bureaucracy that has shut down a lot of the production of baby formula, not legislators. But I mean, it's just, between the markets, between interest rates, inflation, everything is just lining up in a very politically tough way.
What year were you born, Josh? What year were you born?
85.
All right, 1978. You have no memory of 1978. I do. It's when I entered the workforce, and it's a replay. Only Jimmy Carter was on top of his disasters. I mean, he was actually he recognized a disaster to the left and a disaster to the right. Let's focus on the good news. Ukrainian troops have reached the Russian border. Mitch McConnell, Susan Collins, John Cornyn, and Mike Barrasso, following the steps of Nancy Pelosi. I love these visits. I think they're great. I think does the aid package pass today despite Rand Paul's objection?
It's not going to pass today. So Schumer filed cloture on the motion to proceed, which is it's a fancy way of, what this is, but maybe not all listeners do rather, but it allows them to get on to the bill. It is a key kind of procedural vote. Now it's all up to Rand Paul, essentially, how long he wants to push this out for. They tried to pass it on Friday, and what Rand Paul was asking for is not that crazy. Of all the things that people kind of asked for in Congress, it wasn't that crazy. He wanted to put an inspector general to watch over U.S. Activities in Ukraine, and his point was we've spent $60 billion there in less than a year. That's a lot of money. Let's have somebody keep an eye on it to make sure it's not going into fraud and waste and all those things. He wanted that added into the bill, not done as an amendment, which Chuck Schumer disagreed with. So he kind of stopped the unanimous consent agreement that would have allowed an amendment vote and passage last week, forcing the Democrats to kind of run out the clock otherwise. Now, the question is, what does he do now? Does he force Democrats to run out the whole clock or what? We don't know yet. But this aid package, let's not confuse the issue. This aid package will pass this week, and it will be $40 billion of aid to Ukraine.
And it's necessary. The reason I think it's crazy is there is an inspector general at the Department of Defense already. Number two, Rand Paul should constitutionally oppose inspector generals because they are all on constitutionally suspect grounds, in my view. And, it's just there are people fighting and dying in Ukraine. And the fact that he would stand in the way, I have my disagreements with the senator and I have my agreements with the senator. This one I do not get. But I like the fact that Susan Collins, John Cornyn, Mike Barrasso, and Mitch McConnell show up in Kyiv. Last question. When did they tell you about this? You're like one of the key congressional reporters. When does Punchbowl News know? When do they let you know that they're on the ground?
We just knew what everybody else knew. There was no heads up. We got no heads up on the Pelosi visit either because of security reasons. In fact, I tried to do some reporting on how these senators are getting into Kyiv. Like, are they flying? Are they taking a train? Are they driving from Poland? And I was basically told to buzz off because they don't want to compromise the route because they expect so many senators and members of the House will take that route in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I assume there are many routes, and they keep the Russians wouldn't hesitate to kill them all. Bravo to Nancy Pelosi and her delegation, to Mitch McConnell and his delegation. May more Americans go, and bravo. Jake Sherman from punchbowlnews.com. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by Admiral James Stavridis. He is the retired Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, also former head of Southern Command, the author of To Risk It All, which I left at home, and I've begun reading it, Admiral. It's really terrific, and I want to begin by saying I am surprised that you wrote about the Teddy Roosevelt, Captain Crozier crisis on in the middle of COVID. How did you were you able to talk to the captain? I haven't read the chapter yet. I've read the introduction and the conclusion, which is how I go about books. Were you able to talk to him?
Of course, and I know him reasonably well. He was an '06 Navy captain on my team when I was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and became one of the principal warfare planners for the air war over Libya. He's a very competent, smart, balanced, sensible officer. So yes, I had access to him. I disclosed that and talk about it, of course, in that chapter. So it's well informed by his view, but also by the view of many in the chain of command by the Navy. I think it's a balanced portrait of what happened.
Well, the introduction is about the charge of the tin cans, which I've read about extensively. I'm looking forward to your chapter. But like I say, when I begin a book, we're going to talk in May 24th when the book comes out. I read the introduction and the conclusion, and so I haven't gotten to the substance yet, but it's a very enticing beginning. I had family on the TR who thought highly of Captain Crozier, so I'm going to be very interested in that conversation. Admiral, if I can read this to you, we talked about this a little bit on Friday, but I want to go back to it. This is from news notes from John Ellis, which I think is the best news items from John Ellis, best Substack out there. Russia has probably lost around a third of its ground forces deployed to Ukraine, and its offensive in the Donbass has lost momentum and fallen significantly behind schedule, British military intelligence said. Despite small-scale initial advances, Russia has failed to achieve substantial territorial gains over the past month while sustaining consistently high levels of attrition, the British Defense Ministry said on Twitter. Russia has now likely suffered losses of one-third of the ground combat force it committed in February. It said Russia was unlikely to dramatically accelerate its rate of advance over the next 30 days. Put that in civilian terms for us in terms of scale of the setbacks Russia has endured.
Let's start with the source. So the Brits have consistently been moderate, down the middle, as opposed to, what you'd expect from the Ukrainian government, which is going to kind of inflate the challenges. And I think the U.S. government has actually been quite conservative, having been burned off in intelligence prognostication. They're taking a very conservative view. The Brits are kind of in the middle. So when you see something from British intelligence, British government, I think that's the best balanced source out there. In terms of what this means, if in fact their assessment is correct, that they have lost a third of their combat power, that's north of 30,000 troops either killed or wounded. These are staggering levels of casualties. To put that in context, in World War II, the branch of the service that suffered the most was the U.S. submarine force, particularly in the Pacific. They lost about 10% of the force in 4 years of war. Here are the Russians losing 30% of their forces in not even 3 months of war. So this is a staggering level of casualties, and the ripple effect back into Russian society is just beginning. So it's a significant, I think, accurate report, and one that speaks to the manifest failures, which we've discussed, from bad leadership by the generals, bad planning, terrible logistics, a theory of the case that they were going to sweep across Ukraine. When that didn't work, pushed back. I'll close with this, Hugh. The other very significant element on the battlefield is not only the lack of Russian progress on those battle lines to the southeast, but also a bit north of that, in the northeast, the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians away from Kharkiv, their second largest city. They're, if you will, liberating Los Angeles in U.S. speak. So it's been a pretty good week for the Ukrainians. And of course, last thought, Sweden and Finland signing up to join NATO, a very significant development at the diplomatic level.
I'm going to come back to that and President Erdogan of Turkey's objection in my third question. But my second question goes back to your book, To Risk It All. You go through in the introduction the metrics that one goes through in decision making. You repeat them in the conclusion. You will illustrate them in the 9 chapters. One of those metrics is under high pressure situation, you have to decide whether or not to charge or to stay pat. Right now, Ukraine may be tempted to strike into the Donbass as weaponry begins to arrive. From afar, what do you think Zelensky is balancing as he decides whether or not to accept status quo ante or try to take back what was lost in 2014?
I think that decision is still poised on the edge of the knife, and it will be determined by what we see over the next 30 days or so. The other element we haven't touched on is I feel a lot of timid behavior on the part of Russian leadership. In other words, having been burned so badly with the failures around Kyiv and now even more manifest around Kharkiv, I think that Russian high command, undoubtedly having been whipsawed by President Putin and shamed in front of the rest of the bureaucracy and shamed in front of the nation, they're being extremely conservative as they try and kind of grind this thing out. 3 yards and not even a cloud of dust kind of Woody Hayes campaign at this point. And so I think that if they remain very timid, I think the momentum swing toward the Ukrainians will lead them to get more aggressive and to go at the Russians and try and carve back some territory. We ought to remember, as I wrap up and answer this question, that Putin still has a lot of tricks up his sleeve, a lot of options. He could go naval and come around behind the battle space. He could engage Belarus to come in from the north and threaten Kyiv again. He's got chemical weapons. He's got, God forbid, he would use one, a nuclear weapon, tactical nuke. He's still got a lot of options and a lot of firepower in the locker. But
I am reminded, Admiral, I'm reminded of when MacArthur kept going towards the border of China, and the North Koreans were on the run in, 1950? And the American forces went too close to China and triggered what became a disastrous counterattack. That's the kind of thing you got to wonder if Zelensky's fully thought through.
Indeed, and I suspect he's getting a lot of advice and help from his leadership. I hope another thing we talk about in the book, To Risk It All, is exactly this, looking at history, looking at other situations that are comparative. I think that the Korean one is certainly one. Putin, however, here's good news. Putin doesn't have the kind of mass army capable of immediately launching across that border. He would have to enact conscription in an already shaky Russian society. So we need to look at history, but be careful about trying to make it fit too neatly.
So Admiral James Stavridis, as I mentioned in his introduction, is the retired Allied Supreme Commander, 4-star Admiral in the United States Navy, but he commanded NATO. You know Turkey, you know Sweden, you know Finland. President Erdogan objected to the Finns and the Swedes. I said somewhat flippantly, I'd rather have the Finns and the Swedes than Turkey, but the reality is Turkey has played an enormously useful role in this conflict, shutting the Black Sea to incoming and outgoing warships, but also home to a very strategic American air base. What do we do about President Erdogan?
First and foremost, let's keep it in perspective. He didn't say definitively Turkey will veto any application. He simply said Turkey has challenges with this. Turkey wants a discussion. And I'll tell you this, Hugh, after 4 years around that big table, at the time with 28 heads of state and government, whenever we had big decisions to include force levels in Afghanistan or NATO membership for Macedonia and Montenegro, who joined the alliance after a long period of debate, there's always going to be give and take. There are going to be differing views. And also, Turkey is a bit chuffed, British word alert, with the Finns and in particular the Swedes. His perception is there are elements of the Kurdish resistance movement who operate in those countries. So he's sort of staking out a negotiating position. I don't think he is definitively saying no to membership for those two countries. And the other point I'll make, whenever one nation really gets boxed into a corner, the pressure from 29 other countries can be extremely, extremely intense. So having said all that, Erdogan famously thinks his own way through things. Let's give him a little bit of time here. I think we can get this one over the breakers.
Do you recall, last question, Admiral, that the Turkish military has worked alongside the Finnish and the Swedish military in previous exercises? You mentioned the Baltic exercise where Sweden would operate in combination with NATO naval forces. Has Turkey done the same thing so that there's some military-to-military contact there?
Yes, and in particular, two examples. One is in Afghanistan. Turkey was in charge of the capital region of Kabul and its immediate area. So they worked with every one of the NATO allies on moving troops in and out, staging, protection. There's good connective tissue there. Secondly, during the war in Libya, Sweden in particular was a very strong player there, flew the Gripen fighters. Turks very involved. So yes, there's plenty of connective military tissue. There's a great deal of military-to-military respect. And final thought, something they have in common, both Turkey and Finland still have mass conscription, and they still have a tradition of training elements. And by the way, Turkey has the second largest army in NATO after the United States. So the Finns are real ground power, despite being quite small. Turkey, a big country, but relies on that big, heavy army footprint. There's plenty of commonality, and you're smart to raise that. That's a good source of connective tissue.
Admiral James Stavridis, I continue to read To Risk It All. We'll talk about it chapter by chapter when the book comes out, available May 24th. Thank you for joining me on a Monday. It's always good to have Stav back to back. I appreciate it, Admiral.
Thanks a lot, Hugh.
Pennsylvania is already voting, and I am joined by Dave McCormick, who I've endorsed for the United States Senate seat in the Keystone State. So my affiliates from the Northeast down to Pittsburgh, from Erie down to Philadelphia, please tune your ear to Dave McCormick, because I think we got to hold this seat. It's a Pat Toomey retirement, and Dave McCormick is the most electable conservative in the race. Good morning, Dave. Welcome back to the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Hey, good morning, Hugh. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm really honored by your endorsement, so thank you so much for that.
Well, I may be in trouble with you because I had Senator Cotton on, and I said, do you airborne guys in the 101st shake hands with each other in a secret way? He said, I think you just put Dave in the wrong division. He's 82nd Airborne, and that's where he got his Bronze Star. I said, oops, I hope he's still talking to me. So sorry about that. The 82nd and the 101st are very different divisions.
Yeah, for sure. Great soldiers and a great senator in Tom Cotton.
Dave McCormick, talk to me. The one thing I didn't know is I was getting ready to do the endorsement to the 8 people who live near Sharon on the Ohio border that listen to me. You got a PhD from Princeton. What was that in?
That was in international relations and economics, and it was at the time it was the transition out of the Cold War. So I wrote a dissertation that became a book about how to transform the military and how to make sure the military doesn't fight the last war, which sadly I'm afraid we're doing right now. But that was the focus.
I'm always curious. Mike Gallagher's got a PhD, and usually David Petraeus has one. I think General Mattis has one. People go back and they study this stuff when they're professional soldiers. When did you decide to stop being a professional soldier after the Iraq War?
Yeah, came back from the Iraq War. I went to another Army school, and I volunteered for Korea. And then in the midst of that, the Army asked me to think about going back to West Point and teach. And so I applied to graduate schools and then made the decision to leave the Army. So I just continued on the graduate school path after 5 years of active duty service.
Now, you have served in other administrations. Your wife served President Trump. I am curious about the race on the ground. Pennsylvania is 5 different states, and I try and explain this to people. And I know one of them very well since I grew up 7 miles from Sharon. But where is the race coming down to? Is it all about Philadelphia turnout at this point?
I don't think so. I think the western part of Pennsylvania, where I'm from, is really, really important. That comprises high 20% of the vote. And so I think we'll have a good turnout in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, and that's a real boon for me. And the Northeast, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, where I spent a lot of time in my life, is also a really important market. So, Philadelphia's important, and we've spent a lot of time in Philadelphia, but all 5 of those markets are important. But I would say, particularly for me, not only Philadelphia, but also Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and the western part of the state.
Well, I'm on in all those places. Dave McCormick, I have a 4th grade granddaughter who is running for class secretary, so I helped her write her speech this weekend. I said, you have to ask people for their vote and tell them why you'd be good at the job. So make your pitch, Dave McCormick.
Yeah, thank you. Well, listen, I want to say, and I think you would agree, this Senate seat could not be more important. The stakes are so high because Pennsylvania needs a strong conservative fighter in the Senate, but this seat will also determine whether the Senate is led by conservatives and whether we have an opportunity to push back on the crazy extreme left that is taking our country in a terrible direction. And I feel that anger and that frustration and that fear wherever I go in Pennsylvania. And so we need a leader who shares the values of Pennsylvania conservatives, someone who is deeply connected to the state, and someone who can win this general election, because it's all about winning the general election and then going to Washington and being able to make a difference on day one, not needing on-the-job training. And so I'm somebody who's battle-tested. I've served for 9 years in the military. I'm a combat veteran. I created jobs in Pennsylvania. I was a CEO of a company in Pittsburgh that had 600 jobs. I then served at the highest levels of government. And I'm Pennsylvania true. I'm a 7th-generation Pennsylvania. I have a family farm in Bloomsburg where I grew up. And my family is in Pennsylvania. My friends are in Pennsylvania. So I'm deeply connected to the state. And I'm deeply worried that if we don't pick the right candidate, the right nominee for the Republican Party who has those values and is able to win, we're going to not only take Pennsylvania in a bad direction, we're going to take the country in the wrong direction. And that's why I'm running, because I feel like I've lived the American dream. I've been blessed by everything Pennsylvania has to offer and everything America has to offer. And that American dream is slipping away, and we need patriots to step up and take the fight to Washington, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Now, Dave McCormick, I've watched the race very, very closely. I've had every candidate on except Dr. Oz, who has repeatedly turned down opportunities to come on this program, which usually evidences to me they don't know what they're doing on the conservative side of the issues. But I am now concerned. Kathy Barnett is rising in the polls, and she's a nice lady. I had her on the show. She's got sparkling charisma. But in the last couple of days, the Philadelphia Inquirer has unearthed her tweets and her record, and I don't think it's a Christine O'Donnell situation, a Todd Aiken situation. How much does electability matter to Pennsylvania primary voters?
Well, listen, I've gotten to know Kathy on the campaign trail, and I like her. I respect and admire her personal story. But she's been tested already. She was tested a little less than 2 years ago when she ran for a congressional seat in Pennsylvania, and she lost by 20 points. And so, listen, the stakes on this are so high for the general election because it'll be the biggest race in the country. We need a candidate, a Republican candidate that has credibility, has been tested, deeply vetted, can assemble the resources and the team necessary to win. This is going to the Super Bowl, the moment we go into this general election. And so that's why when I'm on the campaign trail, I'm making that case. I honestly, Hugh, when I walk out of a room, I rarely walk out of a room where I don't see heads nodding and people see that my background and experience is unique for this moment in terms of being able to win the general and being able to have huge impact in Washington. And people realizing that I will be the only candidate in the race that can win the general election. Because Chuck Schumer and the Democrats are going to throw everything but the kitchen sink at our Republican nominee, and I'm ready for that fight.
That is exactly what's going to happen. And if I'm watching on election night, and I don't know if I'll be on Fox or wherever, I'll be on Special Report tonight. I hope the Pennsylvania Senate race comes up, and I'll disclose I've endorsed you, Dave McCormick. But once you win, I think you're going to win the primary. I think you're going to win the general. Once you win, you've served at the highest levels of the federal government, but you know that the Senate's a pretty weird institution, right? Pat Toomey has been a great senator for Pennsylvania, as Rick Santorum was. You're pro-life, you're just like those guys. How do you think you'll do in the Senate? You're a CEO, and the Senate isn't run by CEOs, though Mitch McConnell comes close to being a CEO. It's really 51 CEOs in the majority.
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, the issues of this moment are issues where I have a unique ability to, I think, contribute. So when I'm driving across Pennsylvania, inflation is the number one thing on the minds of the people I deal with, and I'm seeing the Pennsylvanians, working families, elders on fixed income, small businesses, they're getting killed by inflation. Energy policy and unlocking the energy opportunity in Pennsylvania, which is incredible, and the war on energy by Biden's killing us, and secure borders. Open border policies are killing Pennsylvanians with fentanyl, the fentanyl crisis, crime in our sanctuary cities. So that's the agenda that I'll be able to jump and contribute on day one. And I know what to do about inflation. I mean, I've created jobs. I've run two companies. I've been at senior levels of economic policy. I know how to engage on these issues with credibility that I think will be unique in our caucus, unique among the senators that are there. And then I also have the military experience. And if you think about the world today, Hugh, and how we're being tested on the global stage, it's at the intersection of economic policy and national security policy. And there's no one in the Senate who has both those military credentials and experience and that economic policy. So I expand. And finally, and I'll say this, I'm not going there. I'm a practical guy. I've had success by finding a way to cooperating with others, but I'm not going there to make friends. I'm going there because I think our current path is deeply misguided. And I think we need people like me who are outsiders, who have no obligations to anyone other than the voters, to really push our country back in the direction that we need to take it. So that's the agenda that I'll take to Washington.
Two quick questions, Dave. I've been pushing for a long time that the Philadelphia shipyard needs to be renovated and part of the rebuild of the United States Navy. And I've been warning for a long time that John Fetterman is not an insignificant opponent. We got a minute. What do you say on those two things?
Agree with you on the first thing. Couldn't agree more. I also think we need an LNG port in Philadelphia, around Philadelphia, to get our natural gas to the world. It's a bountiful resource. On John Fetterman, listen, I don't take anybody lightly. And I think John Fetterman is an extremist. He's left of Bernie Sanders with his socialist agenda, but he's got a following. And he needs someone to go head-to-head with him who can show why the ideas he's promoting are a disaster for our country, and someone whose biography is a direct contrast to his. And mine as a combat veteran, West Point grad, compared to him as a trust fund baby and Harvard grad is a good contrast.
Dave McCormick, I hope everyone in Pennsylvania is listening. Everyone votes for the electable conservative in the Keystone State, Dave McCormick. Thank you, Dave. I don't know if we'll talk again before voting closes, but it's great to speak with you this morning. Don't go anywhere, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt.